Question: who was Harry Truman, and why was his doctrine so important? Harry Truman grew up in Missouri to a poor family. He was a very intelligent young man. He worked very hard in school. His teachers all said he was one of the brightest students they'd ever taught. He supposedly read every book in the library, but he never went to college. And again, that comes from the fact that he was very poor. He wanted to go to West Point, the Army Military Academy, but his eyesight was too bad, and so he wasn't able to. In fact, his eyesight was so bad, he had to lie to get into World War I. The story goes that Truman walked into his eye test and started naming off every letter from top to bottom perfectly. He had memorized the chart, and so knew every letter, but couldn't see a thing. And so he ended up having supposedly better than perfect eyesight, which is really good for a guy who can't see. Truman ended up serving in World War I with distinction. Harry Truman ran for office after failing as a businessman. He was actually a haberdasher, someone who makes hats, and just never was able to put it together. But he did find a joy and a real talent for politics. Truman earned the moniker "Give 'em Hell, Harry" for his less than politically correct speech, we'll say. He eventually earns his way up to Senate, where he is put in charge of making sure that money isn't spent, that the government's not being gouged. And in 1944, he is put on the ticket of Franklin Roosevelt. And when Roosevelt dies in April of 1945, Truman becomes president. Now we're going to go over what's come to be known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was a policy of the United States to contain the spread of communism around the world, and it gets its start in southeastern Europe, specifically Greece and Turkey. The worry was that Greece and Turkey would fall under the Soviet influence like the rest of Eastern Europe, and Truman and his advisors wanted to draw a line in the sand. Oh, sorry, just a moment. In order to fight the communists, Truman is going to ask for a truly mind-boggling amount of money. Coming right off the heels of World War II, it seems like a huge shock for a lot of the American people, because their tax money is going to go to Europe now. It's not going to go to the United States, but to Europe. And a lot of people don't like this. They don't like this idea that Greece is going to get this money. And it's going to come as a real shock when the next thing that the US is going to do is give even more money to Europe. Now we're going to take a step back from Truman and look at another guy who's really important to this whole time in history, and that's George Marshall. He is someone who is extremely important, unbelievable resume, and doesn't get a lot of credit. So we're going to take a little step back and look at his background. George Marshall serves as a captain in World War I, and he's given a temporary rank as colonel, and he is one of the main architects of the 1918 offensive in France. Jumping ahead a little bit, in 1939, he's actually named Chief of Staff. He's given the option of whether he wants to command the forces in Europe, or if he is okay to be the Chief of Staff. FDR tells him he wants him to be on his staff. He wants him to be the head guy, and so Marshall takes that position. The attack on Europe goes to Dwight Eisenhower, and as I've read in places, probably meant that Eisenhower became president when Marshall didn't. Now that said, Marshall is seen as the indispensable man, and after the war he's named Secretary of State, and then again during the Korean conflict he is named Secretary of Defense. Now, as I said before, there's going to be a lot of pushback to the money that's going to Western Europe after World War II, because it's US tax dollars. The idea is, Why are we sending money overseas when we can be saving it right here? The thing is, because we start sending money over, you see an economic explosion in Western Europe, which you don't see in Eastern Europe under the Soviets. And this is what we call today the Marshall Plan. George Marshall first puts forward his plan in a June 1947 commencement speech that he's giving at Harvard University. The plan, while being met with skepticism at the time, is an unqualified success. There is a stark contrast between Eastern Europe being run by the Soviets and Western Europe being funded by the United States. And for his efforts for this speech, George Marshall is named Times Man of the Year. So back to the original question. Who is Harry Truman, and why was his doctrine so important? Well, I don't think I covered this. So doctrine is a statement of beliefs, essentially. And when presidents give them, they now have weight to them. They mean something, those statement of beliefs. And so what was the Truman Doctrine? Why was it so important? And to add a little bit to it, why is it going to be so important for the next, say, 50 years of U.S. history? We'll see you next time.